Thank you very much. It's a real honor and a real pleasure to be back in Israel and to be working with you on what for us was a tremendously rewarding project to become involved in. Those of you who like to buy DVDs of movies, get something that those of us who download movies don't get. You get bonus materials. You've probably seen that you can watch The Godfather, and then you can watch the little movie about the making of The Godfather. So you've now seen the DVD of Whither Opportunity, and now you're going to see the making of Whither Opportunity DVD. I do think, as Michael indicated, there are some lessons here. I don't know how readily they generalize, but in my experience, when you look at finished research projects, you don't actually see a lot of the understructure that brought them about, all the decisions that were made about how to frame it, what to include, what to leave out, and so on. And those aren't so important if you just want to learn what's in the research, but if you want to go make more of that stuff, which is what we're talking about here, I think it can be useful. So I'm really just going to tell some stories about things we went through in the process of developing the work. And I hope they might be suggestive as you think about your own work. The Russell Sage Foundation and the Spencer Foundation are two of what I would say are the three foundations in the United States that focus mainly on social science research. The third is the William T. Grant Foundation. You could also include the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which does a lot of research work in health care, but to have as a principal focus building new research findings is relatively limited in American foundation work. And as I got to know my colleagues at these other foundations, we started to see real opportunities to cooperate on things. And in the middle of the first decade of the 21st century, I had a call from Eric Wanner, the wonderful and now retired president of the Russell Sage Foundation, who had the idea of doing work on the question of opportunity for college in the United States. And I've worked a lot on higher education, and he wondered if we might be able to do some work on what it would take to produce a kind of program of college for all. And this is really, Menachem emphasized the importance of being conceptually clear about what questions you're trying to answer. If you start thinking about educational opportunity for 18-year-olds, this was my response, you've missed most of the game. By the time people have reached 18, a lot of the decisive determinants of their educational opportunities have already played out. A great many people don't complete secondary school in the United States. Many of those who do complete secondary school are not nearly prepared for college, and just pushing them through the door is not necessarily going to produce a result that anybody wants. So I suggest, if we really want to think about this, we have to turn the clock back earlier. We have to go back and think about where do the differences in opportunity originate? And so we got together and we started talking about, what if you thought of this as more of a lifetime kind of question? How might we go about getting both policy people and researchers to think well about this? And as we puzzled about it, we thought in a very conventional way, really, maybe what we should do is create a kind of blue ribbon commission. The impressive talking heads, the heads of industry, the heads of universities, and the like, to get together and make pronouncements about the importance of equality in schooling and so on. And we felt like in a general sort of way, we perceived that the growing material inequality in the United States was important to educational opportunity, and we could produce ringing declarations to that effect and could advocate investing in young people and so on. But as we talked more about it and we assembled some people to talk about this, we sort of saw, we kind of know all this stuff, but we don't actually really know it very clearly. We don't have the evidence assembled in clear ways. There are a lot of things we almost know but don't quite know. And that led us to think, well, maybe what we need to do is a kind of research project of a rather unusual kind, which is to get a number of talented research teams, both to describe what really is known in the various institutional areas where these opportunity impacts likely occur, and to push the state of the evidence just a little bit further, to ask challenging questions that went beyond the data that really existed, and thereby assemble a rich picture with strong supportive evidence of what we now knew and what we were on the verge of knowing, so that we could see how the future could evolve. And that meant that we had to think about assembling studies that would involve dozens of very good scholars. We had to make those studies cohere in some fashion, and we wanted to make them accessible to a broader audience than the audience of people who would contribute to the volume. That had there are a couple of reasons for that and a couple of implications. One is, back when we were doing this in 2006, 2007, it was actually a very unpopular subject publicly to talk about inequality, material inequality. This was class warfare. People were self-conscious about this. Those of you who have the misfortune of following American electoral politics may remember that during the 2008 campaign, Mitt Romney classically said that inequality was a topic to be discussed in quiet rooms. Do you remember that? And we thought it was an urgent matter for public discussion. And so we wanted to reach people with good, clear evidence, but accessibly presented. And the greatest challenge, really, as it turned out, is that reporters, like most Americans, believed the story was lots of inequality within a generation, but fantastic opportunity in the United States, huge mobility in the United States. And this is just, totally wrong. This isn't a claim about whether mobility is increasing or decreasing and all that, which is controversial, difficult to measure, difficult to define question. But the reporters were right about the inequality, wrong about the opportunity. And like teachers, it's hard to get them to change. It's hard to get them to think differently about a thing like this. But then we also recognized that we needed to do two very challenging things to make this project work. One was, you think about getting 25 research teams, as it turned out we got, to all stay on schedule and not only produce good work, but produce good work that had some important characteristics. It had to be accessibly, coherently presented, and be capable of being integrated into a whole that people could comprehend. And it became important to us early on to make sure that the authors addressed the question that Dick highlighted in the model he presented early, which is not just what, in gross terms, is the relationship between material inequality and educational opportunity, but what are the channels through which these effects operate? One of the things we could see, and the great sociologist Sandy Jenks emphasizes to us in the planning process, is we have in the United States two big factions of people who say, unless you fix the inequality of income, you can't do anything about education, on the one hand. And on the other hand, a faction that says, inequality of income is here to stay. That gives us no excuse for not making education equal. Well, this is a dialogue of the deaf. These are people who aren't listening to what one another say. They're not confronting each other's arguments. And the obvious thing to think is that neither of these is the whole truth. So we wanted to ask, to what degree does inequality directly hamper students' development? To what degree does it hamper students' development through the way it has an impact on schools that one might address in a constructive way? So we realized, some incredibly talented and forceful and persistent, demanding leaders who would be respected by all these research teams. And recruiting those people to lead the project was absolutely essential. We also had to convince our boards that this was a sensible thing to do. And that was really difficult. In retrospect, of course, our boards feel like they were geniuses because this is one of the most successful things that we've done. But at the time we were doing it, and I think there's a big point here that I've been thinking about. As Dick emphasized, 90% of the stuff in that volume is descriptive. It's a bunch of little papers, none of which is material for the American Economic Review or big-time research publication. It's a bunch of useful pieces of knowledge that accumulate to something really important. But what it looks like from a board's point of view is it's just a great big long literature review, you know, and that's not what we do. And it was actually really tough to get them to see how valuable a thing like that could be. It also reflects the fact that I've learned in 11 years at a foundation, boards love risk and hate failure. And so it's very difficult. You know, they have trouble changing too, I guess, like teachers and reporters. The other half of this, of course, was the tremendous sales job we had to give to initially Becky Blank and Dick Murnane to take this thing on. And my most vivid memory of what was actually a very challenging process, because we had this three-way process going on where Eric and I had an idea of what we were doing with this project. We had feedback from our boards with whom we met repeatedly about the issues that they felt skeptical about, and we were getting Dick and Becky to write a proposal at the same time. And so we kept pushing Dick and Becky to try to be responsive to these concerns from the board. And this reached a peak for me when I was at a conference in England of mostly university presidents from the English-speaking world. And this conference was held, believe it or not, at Windsor Castle in England. And I had to be on a conference call back to the United States in the middle of this conference with Dick and Becky and Eric. And I wound up on the roof of Windsor Castle. The temperature was about 3 degrees above freezing, and there were 30-mile-an-hour winds. And I'm standing up there trying to convince these guys to not tell us to just go jump in the lake, or jump off the roof, in my case, which I think they were sorely tempted to do, actually, once or twice. So I think doing something this demanding and in a funny way, this creative, not creative in the sense of like some lightning bolt of new ideas, but a new way to assemble the evidence that could really let people think about the larger problems, is an effort to be approached with great sobriety, and often done standing on rooftops. So Dick has had the opportunity to describe both a number of the findings and the way they have held together, and I think bring a strong message. I won't try to elaborate on that empirical evidence, but I do think that by the standards of a foundation like Spencer, the reach and impact of this book has been surprisingly large. And I would say that the impact of the underlying work is going to be further extended and multiplied by the new book, which will come out in a month, that goes from diagnosis to, I would say, one aspect of treatment. That is, the claim of the new book is not reform in education can fix this whole thing. It's that here is how educational improvement and reform can address the pieces of it that it's capable of addressing, and do that in a consistent and steady and effective way. So I want to speculate a little bit about why the publication has been, the evidence that the publication has been unusually effective. One is the book has been pretty widely accessed. I don't have numbers with me on how many copies have been sold, or either in print or through the Russell Sage website or through Kindle. But the book has been talked about a lot, both in academic circles and in more popular circles. The findings have been treated with a great deal of respect in the scholarly community, and I think have clearly stimulated further work. We certainly hear about people, sometimes authors from that volume, and sometimes others stimulated by that volume, with ideas for further work that can be done, which was, of course, one of our aims. It's also true that this book has received coverage in the popular press. The New York Times has, I think on 3 different occasions, had analysis pieces, 2 of them on the front page of the New York Times, about inequality, drawing principally on findings from Whither Opportunity. The President of the United States, within the last 2 weeks, gave a pretty strong speech on inequality in the United States, and a great deal of what he had to say clearly has roots in the work that was in Whither Opportunity. I think actually my impression is a lot of that has been filtered through other work, including Robert Putnam from Harvard University is doing a lot of his own work on inequality, and a lot of it has incorporated, with citation, the Whither Opportunity work. And I know that he has been in touch with, but Putnam's really good at being in touch with people, and he's been in touch with people in the White House, so it's not unlikely that there was that indirect path. But, and there has even been a dawning realization among reporters that their favorite story, that huge inequality, great opportunity, is quite questionable. I even heard, I remember this a couple years ago, a National Public Radio reporter kind of publicly pondering in astonishment the fact that he was completely wrong about his beliefs about opportunity in the United States. And I mean, that's an admirable thing for anybody to do, to declare in public that they believe something wrongly and they're going to change what they believe as a result. So why did we have the degree of success that we've had? And I'm sorry if this sounds like bragging, but I do think in this case we did something really good, and we would like other people to do it, so I want to be open about sharing it. I would emphasize these things. Patience. We started this in 2006. We produced the book, I think, in 2010, 2011. By the standards that these days many American foundations bring, you know, by 5 years after the Gates Foundation started, they thought they'd be done. They've learned a lot, and they've gotten better about what they do, and they've recognized more and more how serious and difficult these problems are. And the problems are urgent, and making progress is urgent, but things take time to develop. In the case of this book, we went through an elaborate process of developing the agenda for the book with a couple of rounds of meetings about how should we organize this into chunks, who can do the various chunks. We had Becky and Dick organizing these meetings, and we had a wonderful group of advisors who helped think it through. That was a whole years-long process in development, then went through 2 substantive meetings at the Brookings Institution in which people first presented outlines of their papers and then drafts of their papers, rewrote in response to those. And then there was another probably year of Dick and Greg then, who had stepped in for Becky when she went into the government, kind of relentlessly brutalizing all of the writing teams to get it right. And this was really a heroic effort on their part, and on the part of the teams who responded very well to this. So patience, I think, was very important. This could not have been done without both the great intellectual capacity and the determination of the project leaders, of Becky and Dick and Greg. You know, once we roped them into doing this project, they were going to absolutely do it right. And they had, in addition to those qualities, they commanded the respect of the scholars that they were working with. Really, like, Eric and I, for all kinds of reasons, could not have done this ourselves. But one reason that we needed people like Dick and Becky and Greg is that they were perceived as peers. And their views and judgments had a kind of weight that even having money to give away doesn't give you. Another thing I think that really became clear, and that Dick really emphasized in some ways in calling attention to the limits on the causal work that was done in the volume, is that precise, careful description with good data and intelligent interpretation. I really want to underscore that. The data do not speak for themselves. Precise description with intelligent interpretation is a powerful research tool. It's one that we often undervalue because within our academic specialties, that's usually not the way points are handed out. But for having an impact, for increasing public understanding of an important issue, for framing things in such a way that more ambitious technical research can be done, that's a very powerful set of tools to deploy. And thanks to our great team, they were deployed very well. And then, crassly, we learned that you actually can leverage the attention and effort of very strong academics with relatively small amounts of money, if you are very clear about picking a subject matter that matters to them, about asking to do things that will be exciting and giving them a little bit of support to do those things, and making sure that they are in the company of colleagues whom they respect and whom they want to be in print with. So I think these grants to the research teams were on the order of $25,000 each, something like that. These were not large amounts of money. Now you multiply 25,000 by 25 teams, and you're talking, well over $1 million. But the amount of intellectual effort we were able to mobilize with that amount of money, I think is extremely impressive. And for me, certainly, I think Eric had figured this out earlier than I had. That was a big lesson. I also think, and I'll make this sort of the final lesson that I want to draw, is that we did, well, the editing team did a great job of leveraging the talent of the research teams to help one another. These 2 meetings at the Brookings Institution, in which all of the research teams had representatives, and we had a small group of additional advisors, Sarah McClanahan from Princeton University, Larry Katz from Harvard University, and Deborah Ball from the University of Michigan were among them. They were intellectual feasts. They were really fabulous opportunities for the members of these teams to learn from one another and give feedback to one another and push each other. They also allowed us to produce a more unified set of projects than might otherwise have been possible. Certainly one of the really notable successes for the Spencer Foundation in the time that I've been there, and I'm confident that Eric Wanner, in his 26, 27 years leading superbly the Russell Sage Foundation, would say the same thing. So, and all credit not to us, but to our founders who had the wisdom to give us some money to play with, and to people like Dick and Becky and Greg, who committed so much of their lives to making this thing work. Thank you. So I was happy to plan a somewhat shorter talk for a couple of reasons. The most important of which is, although there may be questions for me and I'll try to respond, I think there are a lot more questions for Dick, and I'm happy to leave some space for those questions to come forward as well.
Thanks, Mike. Questions, comments? It does take one's breath away. The time, the investment, the scope. Help the audience here get a sense of scale. What would you recommend would be kind of steps that we should go through in seeing whether this project can go global starting here?
Well, we should be clear on the dimensions of global here. When you use that word, it struck me as being open to a couple of interpretations, right? There is certainly a huge set of questions about global inequality and the inequality that exists among the wealthy nations of the world and the wealthy people within the wealthy nations and the large parts of the world where there is extremely widespread poverty. I wouldn't even know how to think about that question, but I don't think that's the way you're using global. A second way of using global is to produce a locally relevant version of the kinds of work that we undertook applied to another country. And then I think there's a third thing which interests me quite a lot, which is comparative work. If you have this kind of evidence for several different countries, it allows you to begin to think about what explains the differences across countries. You know, I was at a meeting organized by the Sutton Trust in England, which was doing, this was just a day-and-a-half meeting, and it was not deep research, but just looking at the patterns that one observes in 4 English-speaking countries, the United States, Great Britain, Australia, and Canada. It turns out that in each of these countries, there's a pretty high degree of material inequality. The U.S. holds the championship among those 4, but not by that much, particularly compared to Great Britain. But all pretty unequal, but very great differences in how unequal schooling opportunity is, with Canada actually having much more equality in educational outcomes and educational opportunity Australia doing relatively well on that, and US and Great Britain looking about equally bad on that. And in that case, I think Great Britain may hold the crown. But that's a fascinating thing to think about, and the character of those four countries. You know, I think there is stuff to be learned from comparison, but I think the immediate question is, for another country, how would you go about this? And I certainly don't think you would go about it by trying to reproduce the same set of papers that were relevant to the United States. It would seem to me that a lot about the process could be similar in the sense that you would try to think about who are the people who know the most about this, who can bring the evidence to bear, and who are the people who can be the leaders in doing the work in the way that Dick and Becky were leaders in doing the work, and begin with conversations about what are the salient issues here, what are the sources of data that are available. You know, when you look at this work, looking retrospectively, it looks like we had these great databases to draw on, but it wasn't evident when we went in. It certainly wasn't evident, for example, that amazing work that Sean Reardon did, where he had to stitch together like a quilt the various data sets that were available on test score gaps of different kinds at different ages, and go through extremely careful work to bring them into concordance so that he could make these statements. Nobody knew that could be done. I think there was a general sense when Sean described his intention to do that of, he's young and naive, and he'll come to his senses when he gets halfway through that project. So, I think that the richness of the data is something that was partly produced by very smart people working hard to think about whatever data were available and how they could be brought to bear in this case. So I wouldn't become too pessimistic that, well, we just don't have the data to do the project. But I think some version of the process really could make sense for another country. I sort of feel like Dick should be up here beside me because he's the one who actually executed the process. I don't think I've convinced him yet, but somebody's going to ask a question about evidence, about actual stuff, and then I'm going to get out of the way, and Dick is definitely going to get up here to respond.
Just use the mic there, Dick. You don't actually have to get up.
Just a comment, Letitia. I don't think the grants were as big as you described, Mike. I mean, again, since this probably is relevant. As I remember, we offered each team $10,000 that they could keep.
Is that right? Jeez, we are such cheapskates.
$10,000 to divide up among them. And then we provided the potential for some funds for research assistance. And in some cases, it was as much as $10,000, for example, for Sean. But in other cases, it wasn't anything, depending on what it was.
So I'm sure the way this came about is, knowing Eric, I said, how about 25? And he said, how about 5? And we wound up at 10.
Well, I guess this puts to rest the debate about whether money matters. Would you agree with that? It did matter a little bit here. Rami. And then Menachem, yeah.
I'm just trying to think aloud, listening to this amazing feat, and I'm trying to see, talking globally about what could happen in Israel and what are the challenges. And I think that there are a couple of things that we should be thinking about. One of them, of course, is the foundations. Do we have a large enough base or collaborations that would be strong enough to carry on something like that for a period of 5 and 7 years? Whatever you do in 5 and 7 years, we do in 6 months. But, we may need more than that. And I think that we do need this kind of thinking, which is very rare in the kind of things that we see, making a commitment for the next, that would be perhaps on the foundation side. I would also add that I think that we need, that would be my belief in Israel, the government in this story, in many ways, in many governmental agencies that you did not mention at all, but they should be a very important part of any such effort. Usually we don't like to think of them because we feel that, 7 years we'll have 3 governments and so on. But still, I think these are very important partners. Then I think about us, the academicians, and then I get very, I get very careful knowing myself, my colleagues, the idea of having a leader that everybody would stand behind and see as an authority, it's not exactly our style. So I think that we have to find a way of dealing with the fact that we don't have this tradition of rallying behind an academic leader, at least not that I'm aware of, but maybe I don't know enough. So I think that we also have to change. The last part is that talking about the money and talking about the availability of data, I think we may be in a different place in needing more time and funding to create the kind of databases that one has to stitch up, but it's creating them may be a challenge here. Some of them may exist, some of them are more readily available even than the US because we have a different system, and some of the things are easier for us than for you in terms of a national database. But still, these are issues that may take time, may take a different kind of level of funding and support in order to be able to bring them all together. That would be my initial thoughts.
I think those are really interesting observations. Let me say something about academic leadership, about the role of governments, and about relations between foundations. The data stuff, if anybody is capable of addressing that, it would be Dick more than I. But in terms of academic leadership, I think it's important to appreciate that I think particularly Dick and Greg embody a quite humble approach to leadership. They weren't pushing anybody around intellectually. They weren't trying to get anybody to adopt a certain conclusion or a certain line of analysis. What they were trying to do was get them to be clear and we were very creative, I think, about saying you can have all of the equations you want, and you can have all of the data displays that you want, but they're not going onto paper. They're going onto electrons and on a website. That really helped. But I think also, these guys just worked so hard and with such respect that I think they invited cooperation rather than demanding performance. It's very hard to, when you know how hard somebody is working, to say you don't have time to get your work done. I've written a book with Bill Bowen, and when an 80-year-old guy is out working you every day, you stay up the extra hour to try to get something done. So that's one thing. I think on the government thing, it's actually, I'm aware there's much more interpenetration in Israel, and the intimacy of these relationships is very different from the U.S. It's actually really hard to collaborate with government in the United States because of various regulatory restrictions that become involved. For us to co-fund something with a federal agency, in most cases, it's just so much easier to just say, we'll just do it. And I've, nowadays, with the restrictions on funding in the U.S. government, we have had the experience of federal agencies saying, can you please organize and host a conference and pay for us to come to it because we're not allowed to leave Washington because we can't afford to, nobody will give us a plane ticket. So I think I would say this is an opportunity you have that we actually lack to a fair degree. Then in terms of relations between foundations, can I just say, I thought there was no way I was going to remember all of these 3 things by the time I responded, so I'm feeling good about that. But on foundations, cooperation is actually pretty rare in the U.S. and often problematic. There's a lot of concern with anxiety about taking credit for stuff. We've just been very fortunate. You know, we are 3 fairly small foundations by US standards. I think collectively we probably represent the 3 foundations I've spoken of well under 1% of the foundation investment in education in the US. And so we're sort of, we feel the need to stick together in certain respects. And there's a very high level of mutual respect among the leaders. But I think we're lucky in that respect. And in most cases in the US, working out a cooperative relationship among 2 foundations feels like working out cooperative relations among countries. There's elaborate negotiations and protocols, and we just do stuff, which is much more rewarding. Yeah, microphone?
Just a couple things to add. First of all, we made this, although it took us a long time, it would have taken much longer if we had attempted to create new data. So a decision we made early on was no creation of new data, but we did focus on new analyses of existing data, and if possible, bringing data together as Sean did so well. Also, you know, not all of the data sets that contributed to the volume were national or nationally representative data sets. Several of the really interesting ones were focused on data from a particular city. A second, I think, that we found, I think Mike would affirm this, while people worked hard to prepare first drafts that they presented at this conference, and we had discussants who were very talented folks who were, in some cases, quite scathing in their criticisms of the drafts. And an awful lot of the work was after that. And in many cases, you know, people had a 30-page paper, and there was one nugget on the middle of page 27 that turned out to be what was most relevant to the emerging project. And sometimes it was the problem was we didn't know what that was until it was kind of a symbiotic process. And then the challenge was to convince the people to focus on that rather than what they had done originally. So that took some time, and having good discussants was helpful. The third is, just a minor point is, I couldn't possibly have done this alone. I mean, I was blessed with just a fabulous partner in Becky initially, and then in Greg, both of whom were just absolutely wonderful to work with. And it was just an awful lot of work, and in some cases it was painful at times, and having a terrific partner was absolutely essential to being able to persist.
Menachem?
Thank you. I was wondering how crucial is access to longitudinal data? And I'm asking this because our country is a little bit poor in that respect.
I don't know.
Turn his microphone on. It's only one at a time.
Oh.
Some of our papers were based on that. Okay, thank you. Some of our papers were based on longitudinal data sets, and some were not. What I'd suggest, if you, there were kind of 3 brainstorming exercises. I think that the initial group that included Mike and these terrific advisors put together, and then with our team, was the 3 brainstorming was, first of all, to think about what were the questions you think you'd really like to try and answer, and remembering, given the context, they should be descriptive questions rather than causal, just because of the capacity to answer them. But one list of just brainstorming blue sky, what do you want to know? And then a second are, what are the possible available data sets, not necessarily national, but that would be potentially contribute in some way to this endeavor, and then brainstorm about what might you be able to do with these particular data sets, even though it was not initially obvious. And then third is, who are the people who've done the best work either on the particular first topic, that is the questions you wanted to answer, or second, who really knew these data sets extraordinarily well, who also did excellent work. So putting those three together helped us to figure out how to move on.
I think it's also fair to say that the quality and richness of data really varies across those papers. And obviously, you can't do empirical work if there isn't reasonably good data, but I'm also a fan of a motto that's been attributed to Teddy Roosevelt, which is do what you can with what you've got where you are. I think in some of the cases, it was really surprising how much you could get out of rather limited data.
Your mention of Mitt Romney's comment about where conversations about inequality should remain inspires me to ask the so what challenge, which is to say, how do you get the people who have to work with this information to care about it and to do something with it? We happen to be convening today in the same week when the OECD has presented its latest report on Israel to Israeli policymakers, and yesterday Yad Nadiv happened to host a conversation where the authors of that report were meant to deliver their findings to policymakers here, and I think there was one member of Knesset in the room. And a few academics. And so I guess I'm interested, if we're trying to take this globally and do a similar kind of project here, perhaps, how do we think about the so what challenge, perhaps from the beginning, and what have you learned about closing the gap between doing the research and circulating the research and then making it make a difference to where it has to count?
Those are deep questions, certainly, and I don't think our understanding, really, of what determines, of how policy agendas get shaped and where the lever, I mean, that's actually a social science question on which, actually right now, the William T. Grant Foundation has a project that is focused directly on that, which is framed, it's not, you know, one of the difficulties is when social scientists frame these projects, they tend to take the form of why isn't anybody listening to us, which is a somewhat self-centered way of framing the problem. The problem they're taking up is what explains the use that people in practice make of research evidence, which centers the practice, which I think is the right way to think about the problem. I have this, it's almost kind of a philosophy of life commitment that you can't, I certainly don't feel like I can, and I don't think we collectively have the ability to predict when a particular topic is going to seize public attention. And to a fair degree, what you can do is help be ready for that moment. It happened, and I really should have talked about this. I had thought to, but omitted it. When this book came out, the Occupy Wall Street movement was really getting going. And the idea, I mean, I would almost say, I'm sure this is an exaggeration, but it almost felt like in 2007, 2008, that it was, for a publication like the New York Times, it was in poor taste to talk about economic inequality in the United States. That it just was not seen as a proper topic for public discourse. I mean, I know that sounds extreme, but it really, in some ways, did seem that way. And I actually think that without the collapse of the financial economy, the interest in figuring out whom to blame for that, the opportunity that opened up for a vigorous movement to draw attention to inequality, to step forward. They didn't do very much, as it turned out, with that opportunity in the States, but there was certainly a moment there. And that was almost exactly the moment when Whither Opportunity came out. And, you know, we weren't sitting around in 2006 saying, you know, I think in 5 years, you know, people are going to be interested in this. We were interested in it. We thought it was important. And then, so a lot of luck was involved in the degree and the character of the public attention that it got. I actually had a similar experience a few years before when I teamed up with Sandy Baum, who is sitting here, to lead a team on a project called Rethinking Student Aid, which was about reform of federal student aid for higher education. And it turned out that our report was released right in the fall of 2008 when the presidential candidates were coming to grips with the collapse of the financial economy. And suddenly there was a need for the federal government to look for ways to spend an extra $1 trillion effectively. And we had a report that said, here's some things you could do to expand investments in financial aid. So I think my strategy is to be lucky. Dick?
Comment to that.
It doesn't work here.
Sarah, the Russell Sage Foundation did have a PR firm that it employed to help us to get publicity for this. And that firm arranged for interviews for Greg and me in Washington with a number of reporters from New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post. And it was interesting because we spent our day making our best case that this was important, and then nothing happened initially. But then we started getting phone calls, and people would ask for graphs and things, and I think that contributed to these two pieces that appeared in the Times, and we continue to get phone calls. So I think these interviews with these national reporters that I had no idea whether they'd bear fruit or not may have been a contributor to this.
Professor Yari asked before about the longitudinal data, type of data. I want to ask something about the content of the data, of the measures, speaking in particular about measuring achievements. When you look at the inequality, Professor Monin mentioned SAT. Now, SAT, to the best of my knowledge, contains, it might be a stupid question because I don't know exactly what SAT contains, but I think it contains mathematics, logic, maybe also language, but I don't know if it contains also things like literature, history, arts, and so on. And I wonder if you took it on yourself to measure also achievements in areas such as history and music, maybe also pop music, classical music, and literature, maybe the inequality between lower classes and upper classes won't appear to be so extreme as they are. I'm asking this question because in Israel we now have a new Minister of Education, Rabbi Shai Piron, and he has some ideas about changing the types and the weights of different Bagrut exams, matriculation exams, like maybe giving more room to history and less room to literature and stressing more the mathematics, I don't know. And we are in confusion about kind of measures that we should use if we want to talk about inequality in achievements. I'll never forget one small anecdote, which probably doesn't say much, but it's interesting. In the early 1980s, I was on sabbatical for 1 year at LSE, London School of Economics. And I got friendly with a Professor Phillips from University of Illinois, who was also there for 1 year sabbatical, and he came with two sons. One was 16, one was 13, And he spent a year in England. During this year, they also traveled in Europe, Germany, Italy, and so on. And his two sons were really brilliant. They had top scores in mathematics. One day, he comes to me and he says, you know, my son came back to me today from school and asked me, Dad, is it true what we were taught today in school, that about 30 or 40 years ago, we, Americans and the British, were at war against the Italians and the Germans? Can that be true? And I thought to myself, if this is the history that they teach in Americans, he has to go all the way from Illinois, from Chicago to London to know that there was Second World War, then maybe, but probably, I say it's just an anecdote, maybe it doesn't say much. But I really want to know if when you talk about measuring achievements, are you also looking into things like arts, history, literature, and not only into quantitative and analytic kind of thinking, which is also very important, of course. But I want to know the general picture.
All that was used in Sean Reardon's paper, and that's the one that comes to mind that deals directly with achievement, or in the other papers that do it as well, are just quite simple assessments of fairly basic reading and math skills. Not at all what one would want to know. That's really what was available. I think one can make the case that those are important, but by no means sufficient, for sure. In terms of newer assessments, you know, in this recent OECD survey of adult skills, there's this measure of problem solving in technology-rich environments that may be something worth pursuing. But I think these other areas are terribly important, but to my knowledge, there aren't reasonable instruments for using them on a large-scale basis.
I can add a little bit on this. I think what Dick said is exactly right. And of course, as he emphasized, in the work we were doing in this project, there was no new data collection. So we were using whatever instruments were in common use. My hunch would be, and I have a little bit of evidence to offer this, that you would not in the US find less inequality if you had more substantive measures. And the one piece of evidence that is available is the SAT, which is just the kind of test that you describe. It's supposed to be content neutral, which is a funny idea in itself. But in addition to the SAT, the same company, the College Board, administers achievement tests in English literature and in some other areas, and also at the end of secondary school administers advanced placement tests, which are really curriculum tests in areas like biology and in 43 different areas. And both of those sources show more inequality than the SAT does. They're not, you know, one wants to be careful about more and less in this kind of statement because they're different kinds of tests. But and I think also in the UK, the tests that serve the role that the SAT plays are these achievement tests that you take at the end of your secondary school, the O-levels and the A-levels. And they are extremely unequal and very, very sensitive to the quality of the instruction that you got because they are so content-driven. And the quality of instruction is one thing that really varies very strongly with income. So absolutely, I think those are things that really count and they really should be measured. But I don't think they would be inclined to make us less worried about the inequality and opportunities educationally in those societies.
Okay. First of all, I think that the idea to try and do similar research, and it doesn't have to be, of course, 25 teams, it can be a much smaller number, in Israel, is a great idea. Because to some extent, our problems seem to be quite similar. we are also very, the two countries, the US and Israel, have a high level of inequality. I think we are both at the top of the list of the OECD countries. There is a high similarity in the fact that we are both immigration countries, and a lot of the income differences kind of coexist with the ethnic differences. And both countries are countries that invest relatively little in education. You know that the average in the OECD countries of public money to education is something around 85%. The US puts only 70%, Israel puts 75%. So we're very close in many aspects. The only main difference is that formally the finance of American education is local rather than federal and central, while in Israel is kind of centralized. But we know that there is a lot of freedom and a lot of money. Actually, that would be very interesting to follow, how money that is supposed to go equally to all localities and municipalities ends up very unequal among them. So I think with that respect, it's a great idea. I just want to add a small personal note that this impressive book has also a lot of survey of many scientific works, and one of them came from my university in my department. It's a work by Eric Gould and some other economists who studied how the Yemenite immigration at the early 50s was integrated and its educational outcomes. So just to make a point. Local point. Sorry, Rami, not Israeli.
Daniel.
Yes. I will be talking at the end of the day, and I hope everyone has enough patience to sit through the end of the day, about data possibilities in Israel. And Dimitri is here, and from the Central Bureau of Statistics. I'm from the National Insurance Institute, and I think we have a much more optimistic look at the data panels. We have built a big data panel of all the available data and interesting data in the National Insurance Institute, which is strengthened by other institutions' information which is received in the Institute. And I think we don't need funds. We have enough funds. The Bituach Leumi takes a lot of money from all the citizens, and we are well with that, and we think that we can raise this, we can take this challenge and meet it. And so I think it's all a question of goodwill and of organization. And I think that your institution and the National Academy can help a lot in getting people together, because the capabilities are here, the data are here. Maybe we don't have longitudinal surveys, but we have longitudinal administrative data, which is very well organized by now.
Well, that statement certainly makes me want to hang in for the rest of the day and hear about this. That's very encouraging.
The intent.
It's also very rare in my line of work to ever hear somebody say to me, "We don't need funds." So I enjoyed the opportunity to hear that.
Noah.
I wanted to ask once more about the process. My understanding from your description was that the project was laid out in quite detail before it began, sort of laying out what the issues were, then finding the data or associated with the data, and then finding the researchers for those particular projects. I don't know if it went in detail to all the 25 or 24 chapters or not, and whether that was the process in a sense of sort of centrally deciding what the issues were, getting the people to do each of these issues. And the related question is, how different is the outcome from where you started? in terms of what your plans or perceptions were at the beginning and what the book looks like at the end.
Dick, you lived it more than I did. So.
A very perceptive question. And it was Becky and I who initially chose the sets of authors. And I think we did it in a combination of two ways. One is we did have key questions. We knew we wanted to know about, for example, how much money families spent on their children. We knew there were these consumer expenditure surveys. We knew that Jane Waldfogel and her colleagues had done good work on that, so we called her up and said, do you want to do that? That was easy. We knew that Sean had done a lot of good work with test scores. In that case, we knew we wanted him involved because he's a really thoughtful thinker about that. So we called him up and we said, you know, this is what we're doing. Do you have any ideas of what you might contribute? We did the same with Steve Raudenbush, because you know, who clearly was just a person who had done excellent work. We didn't quite know what Steve could propose, so we negotiated with him over a couple of months. We asked them to write us a 2-paragraph, 1-page description. We wrote back and said, gee, this seems more interesting than this, and we did iterate in some cases 2 or 3 times to try and match up. So we started in some cases with topics that we wanted to address and looked to find people who we thought were really good to address this. In other cases, we started with people, and in some cases it didn't work. We asked a number of people, and they said, interesting idea, but I don't have the time, or it doesn't seem like a good fit, and so it didn't always work.
Yeah, I do think your description was more unidirectional than the actual experience was. The conception was pretty clear and the chunks were pretty clear in broad terms, but I think the individual pieces did get negotiated out. I also think that a lot was learned in the course of the project, so that the introduction that they were able to write at the end is different from what they would have written. In particular, I don't think any of us anticipated how dramatic those numbers about test scores over time would be, and we didn't anticipate how big the change is in the relative investments families make in their kids. And those turned out to be prominent findings.
If I could say just one other, you know, for example, we asked Sue Donarski and Martha Bailey to, we knew we wanted to have a paper on college attainments. We agreed that they would do primarily looking at current population survey that would provide information on differences between blacks and whites. They agreed to look a little bit at longitudinal, and with the current population survey, you couldn't look at incomes because a lot of the kids are independent and you don't know what their family income is. So with the current population survey, didn't provide good information to look at that. There were longitudinal surveys, you could look at that. So they wrote us this 35-page paper, of which there were 2 paragraphs about from the longitudinal surveys in the whole paper. And that turned out that was the gold. And then we had to convince them that took several iterations that they needed to throw out 34.5 pages and expand that half a page into what turned out to be a fabulous contribution.
And for any of you who may know Sue Donarski, that was an impressive achievement.
I was about to say I was going to wrap this session up, but knowing Moshe Eustman as I do, I'm sure he has a short but important point to make.
I wanted to make a short comment and ask a question, actually. The comment is that the big difference between Israel and America is the size of the research community. And whereas in America you have a huge research community to draw on, in Israel it's much, much smaller. And this refers not just to the people doing the research, but also the people that you need to be to read it critically and to respond and so on. The question I had was, what isn't in the book? What would you have liked to have but couldn't get? It's not quality, it's quantity.
It would have been nice to have more causal work, if we could have found causal work that was defensible. In fact, a number of the papers that appeared in the volume had causal work that just turned out to be not compelling. Just to give you just kind of one example of that, in a number of the papers, they provided rich and quite compelling descriptive information about differences between low-income families and high-income families in time use and money. So, for example, in time use, in Meredith Phillips' paper, affluent families spending much more time on literacy activities than low-income families. In the original drafts of the papers, in Meredith's paper, and in at least 3 or 4 others, they then went on to use the data to effectively fit regression models in which they controlled for family income, and they said holding family income constant does spending more time positively related to achievement. And they found negative coefficients. Well, the logic to that is really straightforward. Holding income constant, the families that had children who were struggling, they spent more time with them. Well, so that really, then we had to convince 4 or 5 sets of authors not to include those parts of the paper because A, they reduced the paper, but they reduced the value of the paper. But second, there was no way to interpret those causally, and they really distracted from what was a much simpler but powerful message.
So I think we're going to wrap this up. One or two just points for us to continue thinking about possibly during the break and during the afternoon. I think the emphasis on the descriptive rather than the causal is possibly one of the important ingredients in the recipe for actually being able to do this kind of work, even in that amount of time. And rather than try to pursue a consensus on causal judgments that are inevitably going to be wrapped up in people's prior ideological positions, I think there's an important lesson here that in spite of the fact that 90% of this is descriptive, the end result is, in fact, a set of reasonably clear indications of where best bets might lie in terms of policy for the future. That's a very important lesson in terms of the process and the outcome. The other thing is, correct me if I'm wrong on this, Dick, but we've been talking here about, it started in 2006, 2007, now it's almost 2014. The book came out in 2011, so there's a number of years there which can be a little bit, that requires a lot of patience. But wasn't there, along the way, weren't there opportunities for the people involved in this to share what they were working on with colleagues? There was a lot of discussion, communication, learning by doing, which I think shouldn't be underestimated in this, and that the process that is initiated through this kind of thing, in some ways, is perhaps as important to the long term as whatever summary set of outcomes you end up with. So that's, I think, an important lesson also for the Israeli context, where there is, for quite legitimate reasons, a certain impatience to get to the point about what can we do about this important problem. Finally, I love the metaphor of the DVD, and I hope that you all remember today, because it will appear in the DVD from the Israel Project, in the part which has the equivalent of what went on in filming The Godfather. So with that, yes.
May I just say that one point relative to your issue is there might be no better way to build the Israeli research community than to do a right-sized project of this kind. There were a lot of junior authors in these teams, and I suspect that this effort had a positive impact on their work.